So, hello, comrades. Today I will speak with comrade from Peru. And firstly, could you present yourself?
With pleasure. Well, my name is Vladimir Caller. Uh, I'm already 78 years old. At my time, it was very rare to have this first name as Vladimir. But my father, who was a communist, he was one of the founders of Communist Party of Peru with Jose Carlos Mariátegui. And he put me Vladimir because I was born the 21st of January, was the date of Lenin's death. And so that's the reason why my name is Vladimir. Well, afterwards, with the development of leftist force in Peru, there are many Vladimirs in Peru, but in my generation, they were rather rare. Well, I've been many years member of the Communist Party of Peru. Now I'm living in Europe. When I was very young, I used to be in Moscow. Very young. I was in the Constable School more than half a century ago, and that's why I still remember some Russian language. I was in Moscow at the time of Khrushchev. It was under Nikita Khrushchev. I was exactly in the moment about the crisis of Cuba. It was a very interesting experience. And was interesting also because it was for me the opportunity to have an idea about the some very, very interesting and very positive things you could see in Soviet Union, really very positive ones, but also the other side, some other problems. So this began to give me a sort of a culture to keep the ideas of communism, of course, but with the trying always to be very attentive about evaluations, about reflection, about studying things, not just repeating things. That was the case many times in our tradition of the left movements. Well, I've worked in many activities. I've been professor. I'm a journalist. I'm actually the chief editor of the communist newspaper of the Belgian Communist Party. And I'm at your disposal to any question because you are interested to speak about Peru mostly. Yeah?
Okay, so firstly, could you say something about the origin of the Communist Party of Peru, about the Mariátegui, comrade? I don't know if I pronounce well. Mariátegui, yes?
Yeah, you almost pronounced perfectly, but it's not Mariátegui, it's Mariátegui at the end. Mariátegui. Well, the Communist Party of Peru, as many things that have with the left movements in South America, were a result, a soft repercussion, a sort of consequence of events in the north side of the world. In this case, in Peru, it was the Russian Revolution, who had some in the literary movement, some influence first beginning, and then with the social interest. Mariátegui was a very clever person, incredibly clever. He wrote about 12 books. He never finished even his studies in secondary studies. He was a very curious person, very attentive. He visited Europe, particularly in Italy. There's no proof, but it seems that he met Gramsci in Italy in the Congress of the Communist Party of Italy, 21st of the 19th century. And he couldn't go to Soviet Union, but he was very much interested in Marxism, in the discussions in Europe about Marxism, about the ways to approach a socialist society. In the case of Peru, he was very attentive about one particularity of our countries, who usually was not very much treated by political people in South America. It was the Indian subject, the original natives of Peru, those who represent still in our country almost 28% of the population. And Mariátegui considered that the first problem to try to solve in our country was the relation to property in lands. And he studied what was called the socialist system of the Inca Empire, in which there was no private property, in which there was a sort of permanent cooperation between people concerning the agricultural activities and, of course, the consumption of the product of agriculture. And he was also very attentive about the very important function of trade unions. He worked in the organization of trade unions in the still very weak Peruvian industry in his time. And he considered that it was very important to try to organize trade unions, to organize peasants within a political party. And so he was the creator of the Communist Party of Peru, which was, of course, very quickly submit to repression from the different bourgeois governments. Well, this is how the Communist Party was born. It's important to mention that the big wars in Europe had a lot of influence in the development of the parties. The First World War, because there was a big discussion because in Europe the Social Democrats which were engaged in an option of sort of patriotism, of chauvinism, and the real communists, as Lenin was teaching, that should consider these wars as a war of inter-imperialist interest, in which the soldiers were the victims of those big interests. It's important to say that, for instance, the Second World War was a moment in which the communist forces in all America, Latin America, including in Peru, could arrive to the national parliament. It was in 1945 that Peru had his first communist deputies. There were 4. Among those 4 was my father, precisely, Sergio Caller. And, well, this is some words about how was born the Communist Party in Peru. It had, as many parties in Latin America, a different evolution. Very much related, in my opinion, too closely related to the Soviet Union and the Soviet Communist Party. So later it was victim of the big controversy, debate between the Chinese Communist Party and Soviet Communist Party, and there was a split of the parties, and then not only one split, several splits in several small parties which called themselves as communists. And well, unfortunately, it was a big period in which it was not the Mariátegui style. This means related to the Peruvian realities, but in a lot of ways imported from external positions or forces. I was personally witness how, for instance, in our country, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had a very big influence, most an influence in the line of our party.
Okay, and in the and what was the result to Peru of the Cuban Revolution? Because I heard that in 1960s there was also guerrilla movement which collaborated with Guevara or Cuba. It's
Exactly. The Cuban Revolution had a very big influence in whole Latin America, but in Peru also, because it was in 1963-64 that the first guerrilla movements led by students, young people, students. It's very interesting to underline the fact that the Cuban Revolution had a very big influence in the cities, mainly in the cities, and within the cities, in the young people. Fidel was in his 30s when he was already leader of the communist, the socialist experience in his country. Guevara also was a very young person. Guevara, don't forget this, Guevara became Marxist and became a communist in Peru many years before meeting Castro. And why in Peru? Because in Peru there was a physician, a very important physician, Dr. Hugo Pesce, who was a Peruvian from Italian origin, and he was a specialist. I don't know how to say it in English, especially in a medical problem about the, how do you say, a sickness in which the people lose their skin, lepra. It's called in Spanish lepra, in Latin it's lepra. I don't know how to say it in English. Well, and Guevara was very much interested in this kind of malady, of sickness, which affects many people in tropical areas in Africa, in Amazonia. And he heard about Pesce. That's why he came to Peru, because he was interested in the medical subject. And that's why he met Dr. Pesce. But Guevara didn't know that Hector Pesce was a communist, member of the Communist Party of Peru and member of the Central Committee of Peru. And I had some days ago a paper that I gave to Cuban friends in which Guevara wrote a phrase saying that, dedicated to Dr. Pesce, saying that he decided his political life, the influence of Dr. Pesce. So this is a small anecdote about Peru and Cuban Revolution, and Guevara in this case particularly. So after the Cuban Revolution, there were many young people that thought that the solution to the problems of Peru and the way to arrive to a socialist and communist state was to fight by the violence, revolutionary violence in the guerrillas. Unfortunately, most of them died. One of them was very well known recently because President Pedro Castillo tried to nominated him as Foreign Affairs Minister. Maybe you have heard of this, but this is people that are in the times of the 60s after the Cuban Revolution, as you asked me. so effectively there was a big influence. All these movements that were located in the Andean areas in which the army has difficult to access because they are not very hospitality areas. And these movements of revolt and revolutionary project unfortunately didn't succeed. But it's very interesting to mention that a group of militaries, of armed people, officers of the Peruvian army, young officers that were fighting to the guerrillas, some of them organized a coup d'etat, a putsch against the rightist government, took power in 68 and put in the presidents a Peruvian General Velasco Alvarado. It's very interesting to mention that this was a sort of consequence of the experience of the guerrilla experience, because young officers that were fighting against guerrilla officers took conscience of the deep social problems of Peru, inequalities in Peru. Peru is a very, very rich country, one of the richest countries in America, but with incredible poverty, especially of Indian people. And these young officers took left positions and supported a putsch, a coup d'etat against President Belaunde, who was a bourgeois president, took the power. And one of the first measures of Peru in that time was to establish relations with Cuba. And Fidel Castro came to Peru, invited by President Velasco. That was, in that time, spectacular. And he made a very serious agrarian reform, etc., etc. Well, this was a very interesting experience in many ways, If you allow me, I will mention you a personal anecdote. Some years ago, it was many years ago, it was in 2006. I was in Caracas and I met President Chavez. And when he knew that I was Peruvian, he told me this phrase: Peru is the country in which I became the politician that I am now. And I asked him why. I was very much surprised. And he told me that he was very young. He was 19 years old. He was just a simple soldier. And he went to Peru in a delegation of the Venezuelan army, with officers, of course, and a very small group of soldiers. Why? Because in Peru happened the last battle against Spain for the independence of South America. It's the Battle of Ayacucho. And in Peru, there was a commemoration 150 years after this battle. And many armies, all the Latin American armies, came to Peru, delegations. In these delegations, there was a young soldier, a Venezuelan soldier called Hugo Chavez. And he was in Peru. It was the moment in which General Velasco Alvarado, that I mentioned some minutes before, was taking very important measures, nationalizing oil industries. This oil in Peru was the standard oil of New Jersey in Peru. He was establishing relations with Cuba. He was a deep agrarian reformer. The private economy was very radically reformed. It didn't become communist at all, but by law, every industry was obliged to participate to the how do you say, the profit of the industry should be distributed to all the workers and not only to the owners. Well, a lot of measures there. And Chavez, very young, so he was looking on this, hearing on this, and that's why he told me this phrase. Sorry of this personal anecdote.
No, it is very interesting, and also I didn't heard about this person because my connaissance of Peru is very very little.
It's very important, the Velasco Alvarado. If you are interested, well, my problem is that I have this documentation either in English, no, unfortunately not in Spanish or in French. I will try to find in English. I can send you some. It's very interesting, the experiences of the left in Latin America in the case of Peru. And it's also interesting because, because, for instance, what is happening now in Afghanistan, it's sort of, in my opinion, a planetary teaching that we should be very attentive, very, very careful. In Peru, at that moment, I was in Peru with Velasco Alvarado, working with him. He was not communist, I was communist. I have been always communist. And it was, for me, of course, important to support him. But in Peru, there were young people, in my opinion, very honest people. Some of them, I know them personally, that were very much against Velasco because he was not enough radical, enough socialist, enough communist, etc., etc. And they had a big influence mainly between the teachers of Peru, primary teachers, secondary teachers, and less than university teachers. But teachers in Peru are very important. And some other trade unions, and they were very active. And they developed a very serious, important struggle against Velasco Alvarado. Of course, they are not responsible of the failure of Velasco Alvarado government. It was an American-made coup d'etat from another general, General Morales. He was one of those architects of the Operation Condor. Maybe you have heard about Operation Condor. Operation Condor was a program of the CIA to eliminate, to murder every leftist in Latin America. Well, this was Morales who made the patch against Velasco. But why I am speaking about these young people, leftist people against Velasco Alvarado? Because years later, I met them personally in public, and they were very honest. This is not always the case. They were very honest to recognize that it was a serious mistake for them, that in that moment, left people like them should help and support the Peruvian experience of Velasco Alvarado, and they were against it. One of these people, really very nice people, and who died some years ago of cancer. His name was Diaz Canseco, who studied with me at the university. And he had this honesty to say, yes, we made a very, very big mistake. When they were very young, they were very much influenced about the guerrilla dream. But the guerrilla dream, and there's a small but very important fact, which is happening today in Afghanistan. I have the impression that we Marxists sometimes are neglect some considerations. For instance, geography. What happens in Panjshir in Afghanistan is geography. Is the lesson of Panjshir is almost an inaccessible area. It was very difficult, or completely different for English, for Soviet, and for Americans, and now from Taliban's to access there. And why I speak of geography? Because it's an idea. Cuban Revolution, if it could resist Americans, was, of course, because of the magnificent solidarity, conviction of the Cuban people, 99% of Cuban people, but also because Cuba is an island. If Cuba was not an island, it was much more difficult because the Americans can penetrate any ways. And in Peru, this idea of try to reproduce the Cuban experience produced a lot of death. As I was speaking to you personally, I was very young. At the beginning, I was also very much motivated for this experience of guerrillas. And it was an uncle of mine, somebody of the left thinking also, but helped me to think better, not to. Well, so many people I've met, so many friends died in these young people and these guerrilla experiences. So it's complicated. There, Michael, the experiences of left in the world, and in this case in Latin America. Sorry if I'm speaking too long about this.
No, I am not hurry. It is first time when I have possibility to learn something about the. It is first time when I speak about the communists from Peru. So take your time. Don't worry. All these anecdotes are very interesting. So could you say, in your opinion, present how strong was the Peruvian left in 1970s before the civil war of Shining Path was started? How big was Communist Party collaborated with Soviet Union? How big was Communist Party Maoist? How big was this guerrilla movement with Cuban?
The Communist Party has always been very weak, except in the period after the Second World War, because of the prestige of the Soviet Union that won against the Nazis, against Hitler. With difference, for instance, with the Communist Party of Chile, which is a country very similar to Peru, and it's so comparison with Chile is perfectly coherent. In Chile, the strength of the Communist Party is mainly due to the important presence of communists and the worker class in the industry of Chile. Chile has, before Peru, a very important mining industry. In the origin, the mines were Peruvians, but after the war between Peru and Chile, Chile took a big portion of Peruvian lands territory. And in the minings of Chile, the Communist Party was very strong. And all the small industries close to the minerals and mining industries. In Peru, the Communist Party was strong only in some areas in the region of Cusco, for instance, and many intellectual people, students, petit bourgeoisie, but not so a big presence in working class. When the split with Maoists arrived, Maoists were stronger than the traditional Communist Party of Peru, very easily and rapidly. They were more present in rural areas. The Maoists had a very intelligent tactics to go to the fields, to the rural areas. Petit bourgeois Maoists went to the rural areas to work with the peasants. It was very important. And also very important among the teachers. As I told before, the teachers were an important force. Then the Maoists were split in two sides. One side strictly military, very radical, the one of President Gonzalo. To finish with anecdotes, I met President Gonzalo also, very shortly. I never discussed with him more than, I don't know, if I still remember, 2 or 3 minutes. He was from one university. I was from the Catholic University of Peru, which was in the time a very conservative university. And there were students of the university meeting together in Arequipa, in the important city of Peru. I just met him 2 or 3 minutes, nothing more than that. But I know very much his thinking and his movement. You began this morning asking me about this information, these rumors in which Shining Path, Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso in Spanish, could be a sort of manipulation or creation of the CIA. Personally, I don't believe at all. In my opinion, I don't know how to say this. It's stone lies, totally lies. In my opinion, they're honest people, young people. Their choice, that's another question. That's another problem. I know some of them. I know some of them. Some of them are already dead. Well, don't forget, this is already all the time we're speaking about the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, beginning of the 90s of the last century. So the Maoists were split also in a sort of radical Maoism only in trade unions and sabotage activities, and another one very clearly in the military participation as a way of revolution for Peru, taking into account one of the important lessons of Mao Zedong, which in my opinion is completely valid, especially for underdeveloped countries, saying that the revolutionary movement should begin in the rural areas to try to envelop the cities. This means the peasants, the people which are not in the metropolis, are those that can blockade the cities. In that way, the city will not have the possibility to receive, important production and normally agricultural production, elementary for eating, etc. And Sendero Luminoso Shining Path developed this practice. They realized a lot of success, and they arrived in certain areas to control not very, very important cities, but let's say second degree of cities, and not for long times, but in some moment they were really serious danger for taking and really provoking a catastrophic situation for the Peruvian stability and economy. To take the power itself, personally, realistically, I don't think it would be possible if they were limited in Peru. In some moment, they tried to develop this military option in Bolivia, for instance, and he tried to have a connection with Colombian movement, but this was not a success. They couldn't understand each other. So if it was limited to Peru, in my opinion, it was really out of possibilities to really conquer totally Peru and even more to last in power in Peru. To last because one thing is to take the power, and another one, which is also very important, is to preserve, to last in power. Uh, by contrary, you mentioned also, and that's true, it's important to say, and it was it was completely wrong and inadmissible. In several cases, Shining Path not only uh, killed people from the bourgeoisie, etc., but also people who had uh, progressist positions, who had a position on left, but that didn't share the strategy and the path, the tactics of Shining Path. And it happened in several cases. It's important to understand. This is a problem of many times when ideologically you are you become too much, let's say, with a position of forgetting a sort of objective examination of things, and it was a sort of emotional position of considering that those who didn't share their position from the left, they were revisionists, and they were servants of the enemy, and so they shall also disappear, because if you are serving the enemy, you shall be. This happened. It was not enormous. It was not mostly the case, but this happened, and I think that, for instance, now the case of Shining Path, which almost doesn't exist anymore, because there's been splits also in Shining Path. There's been sectors in Shining Path that never accepted that President Gonzalo had discussions with the official of the government and considered that this was a betrayal and he was a traitor. That very small group and very radical groups, but they disappeared. But the actual president, Pedro Castillo, is victim, if we can say like that, of let's say, the image of Shining Path, because the reactionary forces in Peru try to use every decision of Castillo as a result of Shining Path influence, of lessons, etc. I've been in Peru 2 months ago. I went to Peru because, well, it's my country. The situation was so important. For me, it was important to be there. I was almost a month there, and it was incredible. This honest campaign of the conservative people, the rich people. Peru is the most inequalities in as every country, trying to attack the actual Peruvian progressive government with this kind of accusations of relations links with Shining Path. So Shining Path does not exist, but in some way it exists as an instrument for our enemies to oppose any progressive development of our countries.
Could you summarize a little the thought of the Gonzalo? I am interested about this, how he was linked with Marxism, because traditionally Marx said that the socialist revolution have to take place in the industrial countries, and And so, if I am not wrong, I think that the social basis of this movement was not proletarian but agrarian. And also, what was a position Gonzalo toward Soviet Union? Did he think that it was social imperial? It was imperialist countries, and also the China in the time of 1980s. It was imperialist state, socialist state, and is in this time existed really socialist state. Albania was this state. So
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Really very interesting. I think that the first answer to Marx's ideas was given by Lenin and was given by Mao Zedong. Lenin, because the Russian Revolution didn't happen in an industrial country as England at that time. There was, of course, a sort of small island, especially in the Petrograd's region, in which there was a very important industrial development, but it was very limited to this area. But in general, the whole country was completely, let's say in our terms, such an underdeveloped country. So Lenin demonstrated that the Marxist analysis was needed to be developed and corrected and improved. Mao Zedong even more clearly, because Mao Zedong received China, which is a victim of all the imperialism of the British, even the French, etc. Even the Americans were already beginning, etc. It was an underdeveloped country, and he proved that it could be, as you mentioned, agrarian, mostly agrarian revolution, not at all industrial, proletarian industrial revolution. So, in a certain way, Gonzalo inherited these lessons from Lenin, Mao, and he developed this. That's why it's considered Gonzalo thinking that not only it shall come from not from the cities, but from the agrarian areas, but that the ways and the instruments and the methods of governing, of taking power, of managing the power, shall be inspired also in this sort of rural culture and this, how to say in English, savoir-faire, the know-how of Indians, of agrarian people. I think that, well, maybe you know that personally, Gonzalo, he never went to Soviet Union, but he went twice to China. And so he was very much inspired by China revolution, by China lessons, by Maoism, of course. And I think that his idea of the Soviet Union was a negative one. The Soviet Union for him, as for Chinese, was a new social imperialism. It was a corruption. It was not at all the Leninist or Stalinist state. And I think he remained in this position about the Soviet Union. You asked me about Albany. Frankly, I don't know. Frankly, I'm not at all a specialist of Shining Path, but I think that surely, as many leftist movements, surely he followed the Albanian positions once once China began to show a sort of too big openness, which is also my opinion, to Western politicians and cultures and investments, etc., etc. So I cannot go any more about that.